All right, friends, welcome. We are grateful to have you with us tonight to usher in Yom HaAtzmaut. Tonight's program, we're really privileged to be able to, here we go, here's Ben Walker, wonderful. We are going to hear some personal stories and family histories from members of Or Hadash whose families were living in Eretz Israel at the time of the state's founding and shortly thereafter, and really get a firsthand glimpse at those early years as the state was just being born, both the joys and the tragedies and the hopes and the dreams. And I believe that tonight, as I said in the message that I shared with the Shul earlier in the community email today, I think about Yom HaAtzmaut as if it's like a Shabbat in the midst of the rest of the year. The rest of the year, we're focused on doing the work and bringing Israel more and more into alignment with the dream of the state that it could be. And on Shabbat and on Yom HaAtzmaut, we just rest and revel in the majesty of the fact that we have a state of Israel at all. I was telling our students at Machon Chadash this afternoon, and they reflected on this. You know, most of them are 10, 11, 12 years old, and they recognize that 74 years is so young. America is almost 250 years old. 74 years is just still like just a baby, barely a teenager in the life of countries and nations. And so to live in this time, to live in the time of the founding and the project of building a Jewish sovereign state is still a miracle, still a blessing. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful to live in this year, in the here and now. And so to take us back into those early pre-state years, I want to hand over the microphone first to Yitzchak Hermoni, who is going to share a little bit of the story of his family. And go ahead and unmute yourself, Yitz, so we can hear you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh, wait, I need to exit here. I need to go back up to the beginning. Here we are. Okay, just 1 second. This is in the way here. All right, so this is just a second. I need to move that up. There we go. Just 1 second. We're gonna hit play. We're gonna get this out of the way. Okay, so I made a little presentation about what our families who came to Eretz Israel. It all happened between 1920 and 1950, and so I'm going to talk about 5 branches of our family briefly, and show you some pictures. So these are people that led ordinary lives, pretty much in extraordinary times. We hear about the hardships, we hear about all the struggles, we hear about the heroism. What we hear less about is what their life was like. And there's no question existing. All of it is true, and all of it is very well documented. But the ordinary lives are harder to document because they made but they made very important decisions and choices. People lived their daily lives and dealt with their daily issues. Their lives were simpler, but were dedicated to a greater purpose. These generations are now mostly gone. Many memories are gone. And of course, we didn't ask enough questions. They did lead simpler lives. They had fewer possessions. There were also fewer cameras to document their lives and fewer phones to keep in touch with other people. So I'll start with saying that all of our families lost many members in the Shoah. Those who stayed behind, there were those who stayed behind, or those that returned to Europe in some cases. In Eretz Israel, there were many close calls, but thankfully there were no additional tragedies. So With that preface, I'm going to talk about the sufferers in Poland. These are Ronit's maternal grandparents. So here's a picture that was taken probably sometime in 1915. These are Ronit's grandparents. On the left is Avraham Sofer, Schreiber, who became Sofer in Israel. On the right is Sarah. She looks like she's a student, maybe 16, 17 years old, who would later become his wife. And this proud soldier uniform here is around the time of World War I. Poland was occupied by Austro-Hungary, and the portion of Poland was occupied. So he served in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was a paramedic. At the end of the war, he was he was gaunt and deleted. He had very difficult experiences. And he was among other places in Gallipoli on the other side, on the other side, as opposed to the English. And after the war ended, he decided that he had had enough. You can see that his face is kind of gaunt and spent, and he decided to go to Eretz Israel. And when he went, they met sometime. Sarah also went to Eretz Israel, but she went on her own. There were no family members that went. Perhaps her sister went, and there was another sister that was supposed to come, and ended up not coming. How and where they met, we don't know. But this is probably in 1924. This is around the time that they met each other and got married. And this comes from 1927. It's a Shana Tova card. And we can see both Abraham and Sarah, and the little girl next to them is Leah, and Leah is Ronit's mother. So this was a Shana Tova from Eretz Israel, and you can see the simple lines and the simplicity of the life showing through this picture. And by the way, if anybody wants to interject, feel free. So later on, another girl was born. This is Yafa on the left, Ronit's mother in the bottom center, and the two parents. And this was probably sometime in 1935 or 40, when the girls were starting to become teenagers. This is a picture of a ship called the Parida. Now, the Parida was one of the illegal immigrant ships that came to the beach in Tel Aviv. This one was actually brought in by the Irgun, and the ship kind of docked itself on the Tel Aviv shore. Those who are familiar with the shoreline can look to the left and see Jaffa, and you can see it's the same place. And the ship had 860 people aboard. As soon as they tried to get to the shore, the British who controlled it arrested them. But since this was a week before World War I, they were eventually let go and were able to join the Yishuv in Israel. And just to show you why I bring this picture up is here is the same ship, and here are the girls on the shore, right next to where the ship was left on the shore. So this is the Parida. We know this exactly. This is in 1939, the year that the war breaks out in Europe, and the older woman is Savta Sarah, and then there is Yafa, and on the right is Leah, who's Ronit's mother. This picture is in the late 1930s. Now, those of you who have sharp eyes will recognize this place. Anybody? This is Dizengoff Square, but this is what it looked like in the late 1930s. This is Dizengoff. It's a Dizengoff circle at that point in time, and Tel Aviv was known as the White City, and you can see why it is white. It is all the buildings were whitewashed, and these are the girls in Tel Aviv in the 1930s. And later in their life, they would move to Jerusalem, and where they had a restaurant. And the restaurant, and this is a historical picture. Now, on November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly accepted to vote the two-state partition plan, which led to the recognition of the state of Israel. And the War of Independence actually officially starts the next day. The siege of Jerusalem begins at that time. So the picture shows you. Shows you Kikar Zion in Jerusalem, which is Zion Square, right in the center of Jerusalem. And there was a cinema Zion there. It The building is now gone, but just to the left of the, or just under the billboard is a restaurant, and there are two people standing. One is at the doorway and one is standing in the window. And these are Ronit's grandparents. And this picture was taken on November 29, 1947. And the little tab on the left of the picture is Leah's handwriting, to make sure that we remember and we knew when this picture was taken. So this is actually at the start of the War of Independence. My mother's family lived in Latvia. And this was my mother in 1930. She was probably 18 years old at that time. And she was an independent person. She had four brothers and parents. And unfortunately, of the people in this picture, she was the only one who survived because she left for Israel. She was here. You can see her in the upper center portion. She was a chalutza. She wanted to join in with. She was part of a socialist youth group and wanted to join to go to Israel. And this was in 1934. Just below her and to the left, and the second row, the second from the left, is her brother, who unfortunately did not get to go with her and murdered in the Shoah. This is a picture as she is about to immigrate to Israel in 1934. She's very happy. She's there with her brothers. And here she is on the ship on the way to Israel. And on the right, as she arrived, presumably in Tel Aviv. And she's very happy to be there. This is a picture in Jerusalem. Those who know Jerusalem know this building. It's called Bet HaMaalot. It is on the corner of Narkis and King George Street. It was the tallest building in Jerusalem at that time. So obviously she wanted to, they were very proud of that building, and she had a picture taken there in 1936. This, unfortunately, is something a little bit more sinister. And so the war broke out in 1939, and the Germans were advancing in North Africa, and Ronit's parents wanted her to come, and not Ronit, my mother's parents wanted her to come back. And they sent her a series of postcards begging her to come back to the safety in Latvia. This postcard is historic because if you look at the postmark there, it says SSSR, which is the Soviet Union that controlled Latvia at the time. The date is 20 June 1941. This was the last mail out of Latvia because the 22nd is when the Nazis invaded Latvia. And those who know the series of events know that the men were dead within a week. Actually, it turned out my grandfather, for sure, maybe one of my uncles. The others eventually were survived the war, but survived that part of the war, worked in hard labor, and finally died in Stutthof in April of 1945. But this was the last communication out of Latvia. Talking now about the Minkas, they came from Lipno, Poland. So this was Ronit's dad. He was a dashing young guy. Here he had a girlfriend. We're not sure who this person was, but this was a picture from 1927, and he was definitely a ladies' man. So he was also the youngest of his family. Now he belonged to Beitar, and this is a picture from 1934. It is a group of Beitar activists taken in a place called Ripon in Poland, and you can see him in the front row. There's the second lady from the left is in a motorcycle, and just above her right shoulder is a man with a hat, and that's Ronit's dad. So he was a Beitar activist, and eventually came to Israel and joined the Irgun. The family actually survived the Holocaust because of the woman in the center here. This is grandmother Rosa. She was, typically in Poland, the woman ran the show while the men studied Torah. So her husband to the left is Grandpa Wolf. He studied Torah while she ran the show. And she decided in 1936 that things were not getting well and that they needed to move to Israel. This is the only picture that I actually have of her. And this is a detail of a bigger picture, but this woman single-handedly decided to force the family to move to Israel. Of course, her husband went to ask the rabbi, and the rabbi said, "No, you can't leave. You've got all this property here," and so forth. And then when she heard about that, she went and sold all the property, which was considerable, and then told him to go back to the rabbi. And the rabbi said, "Well, you don't have any property, might as well go." And so they went and they left in 1936, and that's how they were saved. And of course, Ronit's dad is about her. So this is Ronit's parents' wedding from 1946, but this is the only picture that I have of this person who really single-handedly saved this entire family. And unfortunately did not live much longer, but was a very strong woman. So in 1944, Ronit's parents meet and they start dating. And as you can see, they're a very attractive looking couple. Both of them belong to the Irgun. Both of them are right-wing, they belong to the Irgun, and they start running errands for the Irgun. And this was the first of this was a close call. The next picture shows you the close call. And this picture basically shows them walking arm to arm. And they did this at one time, and one time they were carrying hand grenades in a basket. And they were actually approached by a British officer who they were stopped by a British officer who came up to them and said, "Oh, you look so great together, but what's in the bag?" So Ronit's dad, Nathan, without blinking says, "Oh, we have hand grenades." And the British guy thought it was very funny and let them go. But this is kind of what they must have looked like at the time that this event actually happened. So I call this the arms smugglers. They later, after the War of Independence started, they both joined the Israeli Defense Forces. This is Leah. She was in the Negev. This was in the Negev, in the Southern Command of Israel. They were there together, and they were very friendly with the Rabins, who were also there, with Yitzhak and Leah Rabin. They were great friends, and they met him at that time, and also Yigal Allon, who was also very friendly with them. So they started off as in the Irgun, ended up in Tzahal. The Harmonis came from Rovno in Ukraine. This was my dad. On the right-hand side, it says, this is a passport picture. He still had hair. And here he was trying to lose his hair. These are my grandparents on the bottom, Yosef Harmoni and Tehila Harmoni, and two aunts. He was the first person in the family that went to college, and he went to Mount Scopus. He graduated from the first class of biology on Mount Scopus, and this is the day of his graduation. The whole family is collected there, and this is in 1930. And from that time, he worked. He worked as a microbiologist and as a researcher. He worked in a biology lab in Hadassah for the rest of his life. Here he is with a friend here. This is the picture that I was looking for before, so that I wanted to show you. He worked all his life in Hadassah and eventually ran the blood bank there. Parents met in 1946 and were married in 1947. This is a picture of 1948. Now, you can see my dad standing to the left of the picture, and he's got a hat. Coming back to the hat in a moment. On April 13, 1948, I told you he was working with Hadassah, and he was supposed to go on the Hadassah convoy, the famous Hadassah convoy that went to Mount Scopus. This is a picture of the actual convoy taken at the Hadassah hospital. And this convoy was slaughtered. They lost 78 doctors, nurses. It was one of the worst atrocities in just at the end of the first stage of the War of Independence. And my dad was supposed to go there. He was supposed to be on it. But guess what? He forgot his hat. So he ran back home. He was in the staging area right there, and he ran back home to get the hat. And by the time that he got back, the convoy was packed and getting ready to go. And they said, "Okay, listen, your wife is pregnant. She's about to deliver a son, and just go back home." And he protested, but he eventually went home. And so this is the hat that saved his life. So, and saved us. all of us, basically. Dev and Ezra also tie into this story. So you remember Ronit's mother has a sister. She marries this handsome guy called Yaakov Even Ezra. He is of Sephardic origin. His family actually came from Spain to Turkey, and from Turkey moved in the mid-1800s to Jerusalem, where they lived, where he was a seventh generation in Jerusalem. Yafa was also born in Jerusalem, and they got married. And the reason I bring this up was because Yaakov, like my dad, was in the Haganah, and Yaakov was part of a unit that was sent to protect the famous Hadassah convoy. So as soon as the convoy left, they heard shooting and they started running towards the convoy, but were cut off and were unable to help. And eventually the convoy was slaughtered, and they were left, Yaakov and his friends were left in a field, and it took them 3 days to get back to Jerusalem. Not clear how they did it. We never had all the details, but by the time he got back, his mother was sitting shiva on him because she was sure that he was dead. So he tried to call home, and eventually did. And she didn't believe that it was him until he told her something that only they knew between themselves, and then she realized that he was alive. But both of them were almost killed in this convoy to Mount Scopus. The state was declared on May 15, 1948. And at the same on May 14, 1948, at night, and First Independence Day was May 15, and my mother was about to give birth to me. So the state of Israel was born at that time. This is the Palestine Post, if you can see up on the top, and tells the story of the birth of the state of Israel. And this is where I would be born. This is called Beit Degel, which no longer exists. It was a Turkish hospital in Jerusalem, and the maternity floor was on the second level. But my mother had to walk there. Now, this was, as you can see, I Googled this today, and it was a 6-minute walk from where they lived in Alfandri Street, just less than a quarter mile away. But the Jordanians started to show this area, and they were my mother was in labor and was unable to walk. So the 6-minute walk took over 3 hours. She finally made it to the hospital and gave birth. And the next day, and we were on the upper level, supposedly, the next day they decided it was too dangerous, moved the baby to the lower level. And a few hours later, a shell hit the top and destroyed the maternity ward. So that was two of my close calls right around that time. Here's me. Another picture of myself. After the war, Nathan went into the army, and Leah was discharged. They married, and here's Ronit in 1951. And he continued to serve in the army until the Sinai campaign, where he was injured and he had a close call. But he didn't want to stay in the field, so he kind of hitchhiked back to Jerusalem from the Mitla Pass, and passed out as soon as he got to Leah's door, and she took him to the hospital there. So they eventually had Ronit, and this is the happy end to the story. This is our family in the Independence Hall on our visit in July 2018. And I'm sorry if I went over, but that's what I wanted to tell you. Okay.
That was perfect, Yitz. Thank you so much. I'm without words. That was so incredibly moving, and just a miracle that you are here to tell this story after all those close calls. So
that's why I view it, and I said a lot of close calls, but no casualties. Thank God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So each of our stories is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to turn it over now to Ben, who's going to share, I think, a little bit about growing up on his kibbutz. Is that right? Okay, good. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Ben, and hand it over to you. Oh, Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself, Ben?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good. It's an interesting story of Mr. Harmony. I'm a little older. I had my bar mitzvah in 1948 in a small town in Romania. And nobody paid attention to me because everyone was more interested in the birth of Israel, which was the most exciting thing that my family ever heard of. When we, in 1941, October 1941, Romania became a fascist country, and they packed my family into a train, and we spent 3 years in Transnistria, a concentration camp, from one place to another. They didn't have the sophistication of killing. The Romanians didn't have the equipment or the system of mass killing that the Germans have. They did it the old-fashioned way. They left us in barns without food or water or medicine, or in the terrible cold, where I lost my father, I lost my sister, I lost my grandparents, and 3 uncles were shot on their way home in Romania. So in 1943, my mother gave me up to be in an orphanage, and that was much better because at least we had one good meal a day, and I was with my own peers. Before I was sleeping in a barn full of straw and lice and human waste, and people were dying around me right and left. So my mother and I are the only survivors of a very large family of 5 uncles and 1 aunt. And so when we came back to Romania, our home, we knocked on the door, and a lady comes out and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you died." Of course, the home and my grandparents' big farm was subdivided and given away to anyone who said he's a socialist. And there was no hope left in Romania, except my mother, as a survivor's knock, wanted to go into the attic, and she was allowed to go into the attic of our own home, and came back to me and says, "We have family in the United States of America." There was a shoebox with letters and postcards of an uncle that I have here who immigrated in the 20s. I wasn't in school, and I went back to school, and packages came from the United States, and that's the only way we were able to survive, because in those packages we had also hidden some dollars, a currency that was very valuable. In 1948, we were in 1946, we went into Romania proper, because the part of Romania was taken back by Ukraine and became part of the Soviet Union. So now we are in the Romanian proper, and we apply to go to Israel or to the United States, where we have already family. And 5 years later, 2 envelopes in the same time were delivered, and says this envelope allows you to go to United States, and this envelope says you go to Israel. Romania became a socialist country, and if you desire to go to the United States, you would be suspect of treason. An imperialist country, United States was considered an imperialist country, and of course we went to Israel, where the passage was free from the port of Constanza. A boat that were able to carry about 500 people. We were 1,500 on it. It was very, very crowded. And after about 5 days, we arrived in Haifa, and we disembarked into a camp in Machaneh, where we were sleeping in the tent. And this was 1951. And I was very, very shocked. In fact, I was ready to go back because I've never seen so many people from North Africa, from Iraq, from Iran, speaking all kinds of languages and wearing all kinds of pajamas like to me. And it was hot, and it was a very difficult time as a teenager. Then after a few months, they sent us to a kibbutz, which is Nitzanim. This kibbutz is about 6 kilometers from Gaza. And there we were 32 youngsters, 16 boys and 16 girls, mostly from Romania. And we were working half a day, and half a day we were studying Hebrew and science and Bible and Zionism and so forth. It was a wonderful life. This was really the best time of my life in the kibbutz, because I worked with the sheep, and sometimes I worked in the fields. It was a wonderful time. And they thought that we, as a garin, as a nucleus, we would be moving into creating another kibbutz. But most of the youngsters, once after 2.5 years, decided they're not going to go into a new kibbutz, they're going to go into the army. And I served in the army 2.5 years. And then my mother already went to the United States, and she asked after my service to come over. I thought I was very, very happy in Israel. And so I said, but if I go to the United States, can I come back? Yes, you can come back. It's a free country. You can come and go as you wish. I was very happy and to go and learn English, and got some college degrees, 2 college degrees, and met my wife, Ruth, and the rest is history. Well, what I want to say is in 1951, Israel was 3 years old. And that thing, that machaneh, that around Haifa, was one of the most, after surviving the Holocaust and all that, that was a very, very difficult time, because this is not what I thought Israel was all about. It was very difficult, and then all of a sudden, once we are in the kibbutz, it was wonderful, because we were like a family together. And I also visited Jerusalem together. And one time in Jerusalem, we were kibbutzniks on a Shabbat, and I see all these yeshiva boys running out and calling us goyim. I said to my madrich, he said, who are these people? And he said, oh, these are some leftovers Jews from Europe, from the 18th century. They will disappear. Forget about them. We're Israelis. We're a new generation. Yes, interestingly enough, that they are not disappearing. They have very large families, and their numbers are increasing. And it pains me very much to see that Israel stands still on a time of Yom HaZikaron memorial, why some of these people, the Orthodox, who do not serve in the army, do not serve in the military, they just keep walking. And I was wondering what kind of citizens they are today. But when there is a terrorism and so on, they don't call their rabbis, they call the police and the military to help them out. Anyway, I went back to Israel many, many times. I have very fond memories. I love Israel. I read Yediot Achronot every day. I have family in Israel, and Israel is always in my heart. I may live here, but Israel very much in my heart. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. Thank you. So honored to have you share your story with us. Next, I'm going to turn to Naomi Benenfeld, and I'm going to be sharing some photos of Naomi's that she sent to me earlier today. So just let me know when you're ready for me to put this on the screen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to focus on the kibbutz, where I grew up from the age of 2 until my parents left when I was about 13 years old. So I just say I grew up on a kibbutz because those were critical times. The name of the kibbutz is Gal Ed, and I was struggling to try and translate it to give you an understanding of why that's important to my personal history and the history of the rest of the people in the kibbutz. Actually, Galed is mentioned in the Bible, Bereshit Lamed Aleph, I'm told. I couldn't find it myself, but by the way, a lot of my stories now come from my classmates who I lived with on the kibbutz, who have a WhatsApp group. And I don't really have a lot of specific memories from a lot of important things. So I texted with them. And so some of the things they come directly from them. And I was told that is where Jacob and Laban built Gal Ed from stones. And why is that important? Because in the life of this kibbutz, stones and rocks were very, very important. And you will see that later in the pictures. And the other importance of the name is that this kibbutz was established by 20-something young German Jews. We call them Yekes. And we actually talked to our parents like that. So it wasn't a bad word. It just described them. And the name, they chose the name Gal Ed because the kind of translation of the word Gal Ed, or the two words Gal Ed, is that which commemorates by witnessing. That's as close as I could get to that. And the kibbutz was established in 1945 as a memorial to the Habonim members from Germany who died in World War II, and for the families, to commemorate the families of the founders who were murdered in the Holocaust. This group organized in 1938 in Germany by Habonim, which was a youth group in Germany at the time. My parents did not know each other. My mother lived in the eastern part of Germany. My father lived near Cologne. As you know, Jewish kids were thrown out of school, and they organized with the help of Teddy Kollek, which a lot of you know later became the mayor of Jerusalem, to begin their training to move to then Palestine to establish this kibbutz. So they organized in 1938, and they were planning on moving within a year or so. And then, of course, World War II happened. The Nazis were already there. So they were already experiencing the Holocaust. They were actually, my parents and many in this group were actually rescued by the British government. And we will always be very grateful to the British. That I know some people think with the mandate, they were really not good guys, but they did save a lot of these young people by giving them permits in 1939, in April of 1939, to leave Germany and work in the countryside in England, helping with the war effort. So my parents spent the war years in England, where I was born. And then right at the end of World War II, the majority of the group moved with that illegal immigration we heard about. But my parents could not, they had to wait because my mother was pregnant with me. So we ended up moving in 1947, finally. And the one thing that and I will show you the pictures in a minute, because I like to show pictures of the before and after of the kibbutz. And people sometimes ask me about what was one thing that just impressed me and stayed with me for the rest of my life from living on the kibbutz. And yes, part of it was living in the children's home, and that's a whole conversation for another time. And part of it was the agricultural success. Part of it was, and then, again, that's a conversation for another time. The location of the kibbutz was southeast of Haifa, near Yokneam, if you know the area, surrounded by Arab villages. So there is a lot of history there between the members of the kibbutz and the Arabs who lived in those villages. And that's another thing that I will talk to some of you if you're interested some other time. But the one thing that really stayed with me was, if you can imagine, and that's an experience that I think all of us can relate to, is a kibbutz full of 20-somethings, and at that point, I believe there were about maybe 200 people altogether. And all of us kids, none of us kids in the kibbutz had any grandparents. So if you think of a group of people that lived together, and there are two generations, but there are no grandparents. It was significant. And of course, when we were growing up, we didn't really think about it that much. Our parents did. Many of them were still hoping that their parents and other members of the family survived. But we, the kids, we really didn't realize that until much later. So Kibbutz Galed, I just want to show you some pictures of the before and after, because when they arrived in this kibbutz, in this area, there was nothing. There was literally nothing. And it is in an area that is very, very rocky and barren. So if you could, Rabbi, please show the before. You can tell there are two pictures from the before. And of course, that's where people lived at the beginning. But then the next picture really tells the story of Galed. What they're doing, and it's kind of hard to see, these are men and women, and what they spent hours and hours and days and months and years was clearing that area of all the rocks and stones. It is an area of Israel that used to be incredibly rocky. And when you travel there today, you still see areas that are that rocky. So that was one main reason why we all lived in children's houses, other than the ideology, but men and women needed out there to do the work. We just visited actually in November there are some pictures of the after, and you will see what that area looks like, if you please, Rabbi. So that's a very common picture of the center of any kibbutz, but just keep in mind that rocky area you saw before. And then, of course, you know, full of trees and greenery. This is in the winter and spring, but still. And then the view is just gorgeous. It's the Emek, the valley view. So that's the kibbutz. Because it is Yom HaAtzmaut, I just want to say a few words about Milchemet HaAtzmaut, which of course I don't remember much, but you'll be surprised. Some of my friends on the kibbutz told me a couple of stories I did not remember. We were 3 years old at the time, living in the children's house, and the kibbutz members were on very good terms with the Arab villages around. The kibbutz is close to what is called the Meshulash, which is used to be the border with Jordan. But the kibbutz was pretty quiet there. There were no major battles. No, problems of planes flying, except that one of the kids remembered that there was one plane that all of a sudden was over, and they all said, that's ours, and calmed the kids down. And another thing that they were telling me, I had no memory of it, because it was very quiet there and pretty calm. The members of the kibbutz, what they did during the war was pretty much in the defense of the kibbutz. They were on patrols, men and women, day and night. And there was only one incident where there was an alarm or a threat, or somebody said that something is going to happen. And the members that were nearby ran to the children's home. We were 3 years old. They took each child on each side and brought them very fast to the shelter, and it ended up not being a whole lot. So it was pretty quiet. My mother tells a story about her being at night on guard by the cow, whatever, house of the cows, where the cows were. And she used to tell us this all the time, how it was very quiet, and all of a sudden she kept hearing those noises, and she was sure it was the enemy, and she ran. She was supposed to be on guard, of course, and it turned out it was the cow noises that she was hearing. But basically, this is how the War of Independence was experienced on the kibbutz. I myself was at the Hebrew University during the 6-Day War, and I was already on the reserve. I finished my basic training and my service a year earlier. And so I went during this 6-Day War. I was in Natzeret. I was in the communications corps. I was teaching the Morse code at that time. And what I remember from that war, other than all the other things that everybody remembers, is I was in Natzeret, and those of you that know the map of the north know that the Emek, the valley, is right there. So Natzeret is high in the mountains, and in the valley there still is an Air Force base where my father was in the reserve. So we were both in the reserve at the same time, and experienced it, lucky for us, you know, everybody stayed well. I still visit frequently. My family is there, and when we go, we kind of try to travel in several places, but my favorite part of the country still is the north, and that is my suggestion to all of you. If you go back to visit, if you go on a trip, please remember to visit the north. It is beautiful. It is really still the way it's looked many years ago. I mean, prettier, and very historic. That is my favorite part of the country, but of course I grew up over there. And for those of you that plan a trip in the near future, I did get some of these pictures online from a website called Lily's Travel Diaries. If you look for Kibbutz Galed, those pictures are on there, and then she talks a lot about, you know, what tourists could really get out of visiting that area. It's beautiful, and there are other things that you can find there to visit, but that is my kibbutz home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you. We have one final speaker tonight, and that is Shlomit Fritz Finkelstein. You may need to turn your volume up just a little higher to hear Shlomit. So let's see now.
Can
Go
you
ahead,
hear me?
Shlomit. Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So first of all, I really want to thank the three people that spoke before me. And I'm amazed at how many points of stories resonated with my own. But I would like to tell you, I was born in Palestine, but grew up in Israel. So at the age of 4, in 1947, often we heard the sirens going off. And this was the mark that we have to run into the open trenches because the Brits were in the skies. One picture that I remember very clearly, I still remember the face of the pilot. He flew very low. We were 4 years old. We waved hi to him. He returned the hi. And in hindsight, I wondered some years later if he chose to drop the bombs on the nearby factory rather than on us, thanks to our hi as children who greeted his smiling face. In November 29 of the same year, I was deeply asleep when they counted the votes in the United Nations. My sister was already 9 years old, and she understood that this was a great moment, wanted very much to wake me up. My dad forbade. So, you know, the floors are tiled. She put on her shoes and started marching in the house back and forth, hoping that the noise would wake me up. It didn't. I'm still regretting missing this unique, unusual moment where they counted the votes in the United Nations. However, it didn't take too many years to understand that this place that during the time became Israel was very special for Jews. And it started by a rather common event of waking up in the morning and realizing that a stranger had slept over. Mom, who is this person from the town? This was clear that I'm not invited to ask anything further. My aunt would have said it sort of was in the air. But I developed quite quickly the feeling that this person who had spent the night over survived hell just because he was Jewish, made it to Israel. And what's special in Israel is that there, he or she had to work hard, but could do that, had to learn Hebrew, to find a job, and to raise a family. I grew up in a secular family, but I grew up in Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak then, as today, next to Jerusalem, is the most Orthodox town in Israel. My mother was on the committee of the city for naming the streets. I'll never forget how one day she came home, proud, victorious, joyful. Our street is not going to be named after the Maharal of Prague, this mystic with his golem from the 16th century. It's going to be named after Mordechai Anilevich, who led the rebel in Ghetto Warsaw. I fought hard for it. Then I realized that in Israel, and specifically in Bnei Brak, Judaism has many faces, and not always they are living in peace with each other. I went to a secular school. We studied Bible 5 times a week. And we studied it as literature, as great poetry, as the collective memory of our people, as the foundation of our ethics, and as the foundation of our Hebrew. We also studied history. However, our curriculum in Jewish history ended just before World War II, which means that even though I attended a wonderful school, our history classes didn't have a single class about the Holocaust or about the foundation of the State of Israel. One possibility, of course, it was not history yet. It was too recent. We knew about those from stories by people, from listening to radio, by meeting people, by having some friends that, although babies, were themselves Holocaust survivors. So this was the feeling and the connection with the Shoah. With Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, usually we would have a ceremony in school. We would ask to come with white shirts, and we would read poems and stories, and of course, on the way to school, start with the rest of Israel on Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers, to stand this minute in total stillness. Still a unique event in Israel today, where in the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, the world comes to stillness. As teenagers, I don't know if it's funny or it's sad, we, the girls, really were jealous of Hannah Senesh. We all wanted to be paratroopers, going into Hungary to save Jews, being caught by those, excuse me, bastards, and being executed by the Nazi Hungarians. Well, immediately follow Yom HaZikaron, like we know tonight, is Yom HaAtzmaut. It was celebrated at my youth in a very, very military way. There were lots of beautiful choreography in the sky, of the aeroplanes, there were marches. The entire feeling was of a mighty country, very young, very hopeful, everything fantastic. However, for all the weekdays, between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, in Yiddish and in Hebrew, there was the corner in which people announced names of relatives for whom they were looking. When I graduated from high school, Eichmann was caught. The Eichmann trial shook our collective consciousness. The entire nation listened, bled, remembered, and vowed to never forget. Then my friends were drafted to the military. Our luckiest ones could join us on Friday nights for our parties. The really lucky ones ended up in the hospital. But too often we had to attend funerals, to pay condolences visits to the parents, to contribute poems, stories to memorial books, and to plant trees to honor and commemorate our fallen friends. Throughout our young lives, there were a lot of armed conflicts with everybody around us, like a peace that we have now in Egypt and Jordan was not, we didn't even dare to have it as a wishful thinking. And the definition of each such conflict differed, and the length was different, the mighty was different. There was even the 1956 full-fledged war in Sinai. Nonetheless, we were young, we studied, we fell in love, we read books, we played music, but we started every morning by listening to the 7 o'clock news of the day. Then came 1967. My male friends already in their reserves. were drafted to the war. I, with my car, was drafted as an ambulance. The real ambulances were drafted by the military. I can't tell you how scary it is to drive at night with a passenger that needs to be rushed to the ER when the city is completely dark. And on top of that, the lights of my own car are painted blue to make sure that no bomber can see us from the air. The war lasted 7 days, 6 days, in fact, yes. It started with a really deep existential fear. However, this was softened, shall I say even sweetened, by a rare sense of selfless camaraderie. Not only family and friends, strangers as well. This was really Israel at its greatest beauty. We won the war. It was euphoric. And then things started to change.
Thank you, Shlomit. I'll just say personally that, as somebody who didn't grow up with survivors in my family to share their stories and didn't grow up with direct family connections to Israel, I feel like I have family in each of all of you who have shared your stories tonight. And in some way, I'm gonna adopt your family stories as my own and feel a deep personal connection through them. So I just feel so grateful. What I want to do to close is two things. I would like, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read the text of the Declaration of Independence together. It's not very long, and I'd love to read this out loud with any of you who would volunteer to be a reader. I'll read some, but if you just raise your hand, either use the raise hand function or just raise your own hand if you would be willing to read a paragraph here or there. Okay, Sherry, Kathy, Naomi, Mark. Great. So what I'll do is I'll read a bit and then I'll call and we'll just trade off, the four of us, myself, Sherry, Kathy.
I don't have it though.
That's okay. I'm going to put it on my screen so everyone's going to have it in front of them. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. So I'll pass it over now to Sherry, and you can read as much as you want and then pass it to Kathy.
Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned to their masses, pioneers, mapalim, immigrants coming to Eretz Yisrael in defiance of restrictive legislation, and defenders. They made deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace, but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants, and aspiring towards independent nationhood. I feel verklempt. I'll pass it on. Kathy.
In the year 5657 or 1897, at the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. This right was recognized in the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd November, 1917, and reaffirmed in the mandate of the League of Nations, which in particular, gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, and to the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Comity of Nations. I'll pass it on.
Mark, go ahead.
Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continued to migrate to Eretz Yisrael, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. In the Second World War, the Jewish community of this country contributed its full share to the struggle of the freedom and peace-loving nations against the forces of Nazi wickedness, and by the blood of its soldiers and its war effort, gained the right to be reckoned among the peoples who founded the United Nations. On the 29th November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. I'll pass it on.
This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. Accordingly, we, members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Israel, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. I'll pass it on to Sherry.
We declare that with effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, the eve of Sabbath, the 6th ER 5708, May 15th, 1948, until the establishment of the elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which shall be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly not later than the 1st of October, 1948. The People's Council shall act as a provisional council of state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, shall be the provisional government of the Jewish state, to be called Israel. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Kathy. Kathy.
Got it. The state of Israel is prepared to cooperate with the agencies and representatives of the United Nations in implementing the resolution of the General Assembly of the 29th November, 1947, and will take steps to bring about the economic union of the whole of Eretz Israel. We appeal to the United Nations to assist the Jewish people in the building up of its state and to receive the state of Israel into the Comity of Nations. we appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. Mark?
We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally round the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at this session of the Provisional Council of the State on the soil of the homeland, in the city of Tel Aviv, on the Sabbath Eve, the 5th day of ER 5708, 14th day of May, 1948.
Thank you. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May that dream continue to be so. We'll close tonight by singing Hatikva. I'm gonna mute all of you so you can join me in singing along from your homes. Feel free to rise. O Lord, Baleva, Penihima, Nefesh Yehudi, Omiyah, Penihima, Ein Letzion, Sophia, O lo avda tikvateinu, hatikva bat shnot alpayim, liotam chofshi be'artzeinu eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim, liotam chofshi be'artzeinu eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. Yom HaAtzmaut Sameach. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you all to everyone who shared their stories. I'm so glad now they're recorded for posterity on our YouTube, so you can go back and watch them and share them with friends if you'd like. Happy 74th birthday, Israel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
May the
much.
declarations and the Declaration of Independence come to be.
Amen. Always ever a work in progress. Amen, amen.
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 Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.